Good evening, everybody. My name is M. Solarova. I'm the program manager here at Czech Center New York, and I am thrilled to welcome you here tonight for Art Talk, Journeys into American Museums with the incredible Milena Kalinovska, a curator extraordinaire. She was recently the director of Modern and Contemporary Art Collection at the National Gallery Prague, and her credits include renowned institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, such as the Director of Public Programs and Education at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., the Director of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, Associate Curator at the New Museum here in New York, and Exhibitions Director of Riverside Studios, London. She has curated over 40 exhibitions and has contributed to numerous publications. She was nominated for the Turner Prize in 1985 and holds a number of awards for her curatorial, educational, and publication achievements. Today, Ms. Kalinovska will tell us how three Czech artists from three different generations managed to transcend Czech or Czechoslovak borders with their innovative work and become internationally recognized names. They are, of course, Frantisek Kupka, Jiri Kolar, and Magdalena Jetelova. There will be a discussion with Ms. Kalinovska following her presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat while we're talking, and we will ask them at the end. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Ms. Milena Kalinovska.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I would like to extend a few thanks. First of all, to the audience. I will be very grateful for your patience and attention. I also would like to thank the Czech Center for inviting me. It's an honor to be with you. And I also would like to thank Anna Pravdova, curator at the National Gallery, who kindly helped me with the selection of the images for Frantisek Kupka. Also, my thanks go to Adela Procházková, who helped me to put the slides together. So now our talk. It is really about three major international Czech artists from different generations. And our question is, how did they achieve the international recognition and what helped them to enter the museums in the United States, both in terms of being invited to exhibitions, as well as how their work have ended up in the collection. The big questions always are, what is it in the artist and their work that is so particular that it brings them to the attention? Is it a particular style? Is it a timing? Are they part of a particular group? These are the questions we always ask. Is there something about the work which is greatly original? And I think that always plays a role. That in itself probably would not be enough, because they need to get to the museums, to the collections. So the next group of people that are very important are those around the artists themselves, their friends, curators, collectors, galleries. Our question this evening will be, what made Frantisek Kupka be noticed by Alfred Barr, the most important art historian at the beginning of the 20th century in New York, who was the first director of the Museum of Modern Art? Yeti Collage was noticed by Thomas Messer, director of the Guggenheim Museum, from whom he also received an exhibition. Linda Shearer was a curator of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, and it is through her that Magdalena Jetelova received her first important show in New York. Let us begin. So first slide for Frantisek Kupka. Frantisek Kupka was born in 1971 in what was then Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Czech part of the country. And he died in 1957 in Paris, on the outskirts of Paris in a place called Poitiers. Poitiers was also a center for many of the other artists with whom he exchanged ideas. It was important for him. Frantisek Kupka has had a very classical education. You can look at the next slide. He studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, and then he continued to study at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He was very familiar with philosophies, with the movements in art. And you can say that for him, probably spirituality was one of the key elements that has traveled with him throughout his whole life. For him, the relationship and symbiotic between the arts, science, and religions was something that guided him throughout. When we look at this particular painting from 1898, I would like you to remember it. The Lotus Soul. It's a wonderful aquarelle, watercolor on paper. And what you can see on the left panel is a human being appearing from the lotus. It really is the beginning of life. You can see that his sensitivity to color was amazing. They are very soft, because what we are seeing emerging from the lotus is a human being. That is the beginning of life. I would like you to remember it because very soon, in a few years, in 1912, he produced the first abstract work. So there is a big jump from this work to the first abstract, but there is something that continues in his mind, and it's the spiritual thought and this idea that there is a great harmony between the elements that exist in nature. Next slide, please. Yellow scale. This is actually self-portrait of Kupka himself. And I think that if we concentrate on a color in particular, you can see that he's interested in its intensity. What is happening to Kupka around this time? Well, Kupka moved in 1896 to Paris. And Paris was an amazing place for him, full of activities that he really enjoyed. Cinematographic activity in Paris was at its height. He at the time lived in Montmartre and was exposed to all of this. He was meeting on a daily basis Alphonse Mucha, another major Czech artist who was very much part of Art Nouveau. During this time, he was also meeting other artists that were discussing theories about art. Among them, Jacques Villon, one of the three Duchamp brothers, Fernand Léger, Sonia and Robert Delaunay, and indeed Marcel Duchamp himself. What these artists discussed, what were their concerns? Kupka was very interested, for example, when Futuristic Manifesto by Filippo Marinetti was published in Le Figaro. He was fascinated by art that would try to present movement. He was interested in the colors, and as you can see in this particular painting, it is static, it is very strong. He's not so much interested in the features of this particular portrait of himself, but in conveying a certain emotion. And this is another element that has stayed with him constantly. Next work, please. So the ideas that the artists were interested in at the time, which is around 1910, were theosophical and synthetic theories concerning the unity of music and color. It was also at this time that he started to write a book, Creation in the Visual Arts. There was an enormous amount of interest among the artists in music. And why is that? Well, the discussion at the time was, which of the arts is the highest of them all? And it was considered that it must be music, because music did not reproduce anything from nature. It created its own sound. And this is what the visual artists were also aspiring, to create through colors, through certain dynamics among amorphic and geometric forms, a work of art that could be not relating to nature. Look at this painting. At the bottom of it, we have a piano keys. We can even see the hands of the pianist. Behind that is a lake, and beyond that is a nature. But in the middle, there are colors, almost as if they are moving towards some sort of top, as if they are not static, because of course, Kupka is trying to create a painting that doesn't necessarily refer to lake or a piano, but the painting that is self-referential, that is about colors. Let's go to the next. Well, this is a very unusual work. First step, 1909, and it's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. It's actually a mystery for many of the art historians because there are no other works during this time that Kupka has created. We think that it is sort of reference to Isaac Newton. He was very interested in the color scheme that Isaac Newton has created. He was also very much interested in cosmology. And so what you see here are the discs, almost like analysis of color. Notice it, most of them are red and blue. The background is black, and we also have some white color. The next painting is one of the most important paintings that Kupka has created. Amorpha, Fugue in Two Colors, 1912. It is believed that it is the first abstract work with no reference to nature whatsoever that has been exhibited. It was exhibited indeed in the same year that he was created, 1912. It's a very large painting, 7 feet by 7 feet, now in the collection of the National Gallery in Prague. Many of the preparatory drawings and gouaches are now with the Museum of Modern Art, and some of them indeed very closely relate to Newton. It is interesting that in the end, Kupka finished with these two major colors, blue and red. And of course, again, with the black and white background. Now, I'd like you to remember that here we are in 1912. It's a big jump from the first painting, Lotus. But I think that for Kupka, spirituality continued to be extremely important. Let's look at the next slide. This painting is clearly very abstract, and you would say that it's non-objective, meaning it doesn't have any references to nature whatsoever. By this time, Kupka was really recognized as one of the most important abstract artists. Other artists at the time who were getting to creating the abstract work are Wassily Kandinsky, Mondrian, and eventually also Malevich. Kupka continued to exhibit in Paris in different shows, in museums, as well as in his own gallery, La Botière. In 1931, and we can move to the next slide, he, together with Hans Arp and Alberto Giacometti, created a group which was called Abstraction Creation Group. What I'd like to point out at this particular painting, again from 1911 to 1913, is that the elements that are amorphous and geometric are merged here together. Next. Probably this is one of my most favorite paintings. There are certain series of them in existence. The Cosmic Spring, 1913 to 1914. It's also at the Museum of National Gallery in Prague. The colors are extraordinary. They are almost as if they were created, these are many comments, under the influence of drugs. And if you look at many of the paintings from this period, they have the same extraordinary intensity and extraordinary beauty. Next. Here we are already in 1923, when it was very clear that Kupka is one of the first abstract artists. In 1935, he received a letter from Alfred Barr. We already mentioned Alfred Barr as being an important art historian and the first director of the Museum of Modern Art. He let him know that he will be visiting, I think it was in June of that year, Paris. The question is, and I think here we are talking about how do artists move from being extraordinary to getting into, well, jumping over the Atlantic, getting into the United States. It is believed that Alfred Barr, who was very knowledgeable about modern art and knew that there are lots of developments in Europe from Cubism to abstract art, approached many artists. And it is believed that it was Marcel Duchamp that recommended that he visits Kupka in his studio. This indeed has happened, and Alfred Barr immediately chose 3 paintings, as well as a photograph of a large reproduction of, indeed, Fugue. The exhibition Cubism and Abstract Art took place at the Museum of Modern Art and was really sort of breaking out exhibition, importantly bringing up some very important issues. On the one hand, Cubism, and on the other hand, abstract art that really developed out of movement from Cubism into abstraction. There were altogether 113 artists in the exhibition with 400 works, from Brancusi to Picasso to Braque to Malevich to Marcel Duchamp and many others, including Kupka. What is fascinating is that in Kupka's case, Alfred Barr wrote that he created and achieved the first abstract works between 1911 and 1912. Nothing of that sort was mentioned by Mondrian or in the case of Kupka. So this was a very important move of Kandinsky, of Kupka's work into Museum of Modern Art. In 1946, we can go to the next slide, he had a major exhibition at the National Gallery in Prague of works on paper, and in Manes, which is an association of artists also in Prague, where he exhibited altogether 215 works, and 20 paintings were acquired into the collection of the National Gallery. In 1957, several of his works were acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. As a thanks for the acquisition, Kupka has donated many of his drawings and gouaches. He is dying, and it is his widow who eventually donates a very large group of works to the Museum Pompidou Center, Muséum National d'Art Moderne. Major retrospective of Kupka is taking place at the Guggenheim Museum in 1975. And I think there are three elements that helped it. First, he was already known and had works in the collection of the Museum of the Modern Art. Second, there was a collector, Madame Ladek, who had a probably largest private collection of his work, and she was pushing for his major recognition. Thomas Messer prepared an international program for the Guggenheim, knew of Kupka's importance, and offered this exhibition. In 1975, Kupka's name became, you can say, almost household in the United States, and indeed the major in terms of the modern art. The largest collection of his work exists at the Pompidou Center. The next is the National Gallery. MoMA has 51 works, Guggenheim 16. There are other works at the Harvard and Yale. So this is Kupka for us. And we will now move to the next artist, Jiri Kolar, who presents a very different story. Can I have a slide for Kolar? Yeti Collage was born in 1914 in Czech lands. It was still Austro-Hungarian Empire, and died in 2002 in Prague. Yiri Kolar came from a very modest background, but he was a genius in his own way. He was very familiar with poetry, whether it was Mallarmé in France, or whether it was Czech poets, or whether it was T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, which he so much admired, or Samuel Beckett, who's without style or literary nonsense, he very much admired. Walt Whitman was another of his love because of the passion with which Whitman spoke to his audiences. So what happened to Kolar? What kind of work has he created, and why has he become important? Let's go to the first slide. Now, this is a bit surprising. It's a cutout from a newspaper, and it's framed, and it's in the collection of the National Gallery in Prague. In the Land of Peaceful Mourning, what it is, it's in Korea, and it's an execution of Japanese being kind of crucified. Why would this be a work of art? Well, let's go back. Marcel Duchamp, whom we already have mentioned, and who knew Kupka very well and with whom he corresponded all his life while Kupka was alive, created in 1917 something which is a manufactured porcelain urinal. Well, he didn't create it, he actually acquired it, but he declared that it's an artwork, ready-made. And ready-made, he presented in order to really deny the creation of the definition of art, basically saying art can be made of anything. And this was indeed how Collage was thinking. Next slide. Collage was putting together different images almost in confrontation. Here we have the sleepers in 1952. We can see that there are some who may be prisoners, some that are resting, and maybe some at the bottom on the right photograph the remains in the concentration camp. How did he come to this? Well, he was creating almost confrontational images, putting them together. Let's remember also that he was a poet, and his major work of poetry, Prometheus' Sliver, brought him to prison in communist Czechoslovakia. There he was imprisoned for 9 months and interrogated. And had it been for Stalin and Gottwald, who were both in charge of the respective communist parties, died, he probably would have ended by losing his life too. Why? Because he spoke very plainly, though poetically, and in some cases very brutally, about what is happening to people under autocratic regimes. So here we have an artist who is very politically interested and creating a certain kind of confrontational images put together. Maybe at this point, I should mention Walter Benjamin, German Jewish literary critic, who was known for creating literary montage, saying, I have nothing to say, only to show. His Arcades project, which started in 1920s, wasn't finished in 1940s, though he worked until then, and then he lost his life tragically. But he's so focused on putting together found everyday imagery or cuttings or writings to point out or create social and cultural picture. And I think that's what's happening with collage. It's exactly the same movement. It's exactly the same thinking. Let's go to the next image. Here we have, again, confrontation of two very different images. On the one hand, fruit, and on the other one, hanging. Slavery. We are in the United States. Remember Billie Holiday's song, Strange Fruit, sung in 1939, based on a poem from 1937. It's about lynching. It's interesting that FBI threatened her that if she continues to sing, she will be punished. Collage is doing the same thing. He's aware of international situation, but he's also talking about his own in his own country. Next. Hostages of Dream, 1967. The most brutal part of communist regime in Czech Republic took place in the 50s. Through the 60s, we have something that we called democratization, socialism with human face. And so collage is creating new group of imagery referring to that. What we are looking at is a very interesting crucifixion work by Roger van der Weyden, 15th century. What is unusual about it is you have at the background 2 black angels. What could they signify? Certainly not resurrection, but maybe certain kind of a doom. Collage is cutting the image in pieces to draw attention, and maybe the cutting also represents some wounds. And he's doing this in 67, almost as if he's worried what is going to happen out of democratization in his country. Next. The most remarkable work that he has created is called Diary 1968. We will be looking at several pages of the diary where again we have a certain kind of confrontation between the images. On the left, we have profile of Kupka himself. At the bottom, we have his own writing, his own poetry, one expressing the pain, his own description of his own heights. And on the right, you see a church. It's Ulmünster Lutheran church, and it's collapsing. Interestingly enough, this is the tallest building in the world in 1968. The question is, what is Collage trying to say by having the building collapsed? Let's go to the next. Diary 68 consists of 66 pages. We are here, as you can see on the top, page 30. Each page, in many cases, has many other pages behind. Collage became extremely active, particularly during the time of invasion, which was in August of 68, and painted or created works almost every day. Here we have again the image at the back of cutouts, music, cutouts of the words, fashionable figure in the middle, and inside there is a fragment of the work. Peter Bruegel the Elder, the blind leading the blind. But you know, Collage never picked up an image just because he had a chance to look at some image and liked it. No, he knew exactly why. This painting, out of which this image comes, was created a year before Peter Bruegel the Elder died. And it was criticism of the Spanish rule in Spanish Netherlands that tried to suppress Protestantism, and many executions took place at the time. Let's go to the next. This was a publication in Prague, Mladý svět, Young World, and we have here directly a photograph from that magazine. And the photographs is a memorial created on the street of somebody that was indeed killed that day. It says 24th of August, the invasion occurred on the 21st of August, 68. Next. Here we have another image with papers from declaration of the newly formed Communist Party, some writing in Russian and some other writings that point out how the situation in Czech Republic has to be manipulated so that the world understands that there was contra-revolution. At the bottom, we have an amazing painting. It's one of the most brutal paintings of the Middle Ages. It's by Matthias Grunewald, the crucifixion from the Instheim altar, made from 1509 onwards. It's the most brutal depiction of crucifixion of Christ, virtually in the history of the visual arts. And I think what Collage is trying to say is that the nation here is being brutalized. I also would like to point out that Collage wasn't particularly religious, but I think he likes using religious imagery because the religious imageries are about values, values that are common to Europeans. Let's go to the next. Here we have another one with the Czech flag. I love the image on the left in the circle. It is actually, as you probably all know, the fragment from the creation of Adam by Michelangelo, probably one of the most reproduced religious paintings at any time. At the bottom, you have Apollo. Apollo in 1968 circled around the Earth. On the right, it's a rollage which you cannot read, but what it is, it's a work by William Blake, and it's a portrait of Newton. So interestingly, Collage as well as Kupka both appreciated or admired Newton. On the top, you have images from sports. What this work is talking about is a certain kind of humanity. You know, God is touching or creating Adam. They almost touch itself. It's a great sign of creation of humanity. And what we are experiencing at the time is lots of grief. Let's go to the next one. Duchamp, of course, his portrait with the chess behind him. Next one. And it's the last work that we are looking at from the diary. This one is based on the painting of a black man by Theodore Géricault. This black man is completely brutalized, and the picture is telling us that this is something that will happen in 1969, meaning after Soviets will take over, the humanity will disappear. So what happened to Collage with all his amazing work? In 1959, he received Sao Paulo Biennial First Prize. In 1965, he had an exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. In 1968, he was part of Documenta, one of the most important exhibitions anywhere in the world. He also was exhibiting in Prague at Spálova Gallery, and it was the first time that I came across the work of Yeti Collage. I think I was 19 then or something like that. And he also had a major exhibition at the Neues Museum in Nuremberg that has a best collection of work by Yeti Collage. In 1975, he had an exhibition at the Guggenheim. Why? Again, with the help of Mrs. Mladek, who was a major supporter of Collage's work. Thomas Messer was still a director, and Collage had his major exhibition. His work exists in many collections in the United States, at MoMA, at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, Yale Art Gallery, Albright Knox, and so on. And now let's turn to our third and the last artist in our discussion, Magdalena Jetelova. Magdalena Jetelova was born in 1946, thus in communist Czechoslovakia. She left or escaped, as we say, the country, and currently she lives in Prague, in Munich, and Bergheim, where she has a very large studio. Jetelova is the most unusual character. And maybe at the beginning, I will say something that was said about her by Jindřich Chalupecký, a major critic who, during the communist regime, helped lots of artists and supported them, introduced them to the world art. He was a big fan of Magdalena Jetelova, and he said that she has something in her that predicts that she will be creating works that will not be only objects, but that will have a direct conversation with the surroundings, that her work is monumental in some way, and that thinking monumentally and thinking in 3 dimensions for Jetelova is as natural as walking, breathing, and eating. Let's go to the next slide. Magdalena Jetelova studied at the Fine Art Academy in Prague, but she was extremely fortunate that in the late 60s, when Czechoslovakia was far more open, she was able to go and study at the Accademia di Brera in Italy. The academy itself was interesting, but what was fascinating is that she was in Italy at the time when arte povera was coming into being. Giannis Cornelis had major exhibition. And what is arte povera about? It's about using all kinds of objects, using performances, using human voices, using the audience being part of the project. Magdalena Jetelova couldn't believe what she saw. She was completely transfixed and indeed totally inspired by the arte povera. She returned to Czechoslovakia, already occupied, and devoted herself to creating these large sculptures. This in particular is her marching chair, created between 79 and 80, and she has several variations of these chairs, and it's placed at the Museum of Applied Arts in Prague. What did Jetelova said about her objects, and you can move to the next one, is that there were huge objects that were there and nobody could move them. The authorities had a huge problem with them. She said they are marching, they are not afraid, they will be there. We noticed that this in particular was created stairs in 1980s. What was happening in the art world in 1980s? Well, a big return to figuration, but the figuration didn't necessarily mean that artists were returning only to figure. They were creating objects, painting, sculpture, in which they would use everyday materials or referring to everyday, such as stairs or chairs, almost as if they were replacing the figure. In 1983, Michael Compton, at the time, curator of the collection at Tate, as well as director of education at Tate, was preparing an exhibition called New Art. He visited many artists in the United States, of course in Europe, and also tried to find an artist from Eastern Europe. He made lots of visits, and when he came to Magdalena Jetelova's studio, he was really enormously excited and invited her to be part of the show, which was called New Art in 1983 at Tate Gallery. There she was exhibiting next to Beuys, John Cage, Schnabel, and many other artists of the time. But her work was so extraordinary because her sculpture wasn't static. When you look at the chair, when you look at the stairs, you can see she really commands the space. She commands the three-dimensionality. It is her work that determines how we walk, how we look, and where we are. Next. She started to be early on also interested in laser drawing. This particular work, chair, is at the National Gallery in Prague. A very similar version also exists as in the collection of the Brooklyn Art Museum. So you have got here remnants of the chair, and yet you have a chair created with a laser. So her interest is moving between the object and projection into beyond the object. Let's go to the next. This is a big table and some of her projections. This table is in the collection of the National Gallery in Prague, and we are actually viewing her exhibition that took place at the National Gallery in Prague in 2018. Next. You can see how her objects are growing. They're almost uncontrollable. This is an installation at the Henry Moore Foundation in 1991. Actually, beyond this exhibition space, she's also using underground for projecting with laser. So one section is visible, another other section is not so visible. So visibility and non-visibility became very interested to her. I should also mention at this point that she actually met Henry Moore in the 60s. She found him in the studio, and as a young student, she came, she met him, he showed her what he's doing, and he encouraged her to be a sculptor further. Let's go to the next. This is probably one of her most difficult works that she has ever created. It's Domestication of Pyramid at the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna in 1992. Peter Nover, who was a director of this museum from 1986 to 2011, created a special program where he wanted artists to meet the public right in the vestibule or in the major hall and ask Magdalena Jetelova to create something for him. Let's look at the next. She created this unbelievable work, extremely courageous of him to actually invite her to do this in the museum, which was just being restored. What we are looking at is a red sand, which is going through the different floors. Why is it a pyramid? Well, because Magdalena Jetelova was very much interested in all kinds of cultures. And don't forget, pyramid is much larger than anything that we have produced in Europe. And this is her admiration for the architecture that we as Europeans have never been able to achieve. Let's also remember that Magdalena Jetelova adored architecture, and it was Prague with its Gothic and Baroque architecture that shaped her. Next. Predicting what Jiri Kolar said, that Magdalena Jetelova is not only going to be dealing with objects, she started to work with the space itself, meaning the space outside, like land artists, the American land artist, James Turrell, for example, Smithson. What she's doing is, in this case, she's in Iceland, and she's projecting laser beam across the part of Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is actually visible. As you know, Mid-Atlantic Ridge divides the North America plates from Euro-Asian plate and African plate. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge altogether is 40,000 kilometers long, and it's visible only in Iceland. And Magdalena Jetelova is very much interested in, as we mentioned before, with also a memory. And in this case, it's a memory of the landscape, memory of what was and what is happening and what will be. Let's look at the next. The shape of the laser is, of course, determined by the landscape. You can see the gazers at the back. The work is then exhibited as a light box, or with the light being adjusted according to what the artist wants, the black and white. Let's go next. Another work, which I think is really remarkable, is the Atlantic World. There are several of the pieces that she has again photographed. Why was she there? Well, it again has to do a lot with the memory. And the writing which exists on these pieces is not her own. It's actually that of Paul Virilio, French cultural theorist, urbanist, aesthetic philosopher. He's known for his writings on art, philosophy, but also on military. And it is the militarization and what's happening to human beings through war that has interested her as well as Paul Virilio. Let's go to the next slide. This is all about the bunkers that were built by the Nazi. Let's just remember that there were altogether 15,000 Nazi bunkers built during the World War II along the coastline in France alone. Next. This is one of her most recent projects. She traveled to Patagonia and created a group of works called Pacific Ring of Fire. What she's interested here again is drawing with a laser on the landscape, but she's talking here about the landscape of icebergs that is slowly disappearing in front of our eyes. Next. This is her installation at the National Gallery in Prague in Veletržní Palác. You can see her monumentality is quite remarkable. Here she is in the functionalist building, creating a work. It's not a sculpture, it's an installation. It's almost like representation of oil field. And she's bringing to our attention how nature is being changed by the human activity. In this case, certainly not for the better. So you know, with Magdalena Jetelova producing all of this remarkable work, and what happened to her after her exhibition at Tate. In 1985, she was invited to present her work at the Riverside Studios in London. Riverside Studios was one of the most experimental places, showing artists from Britain, from Richard Deacon, Anish Kapoor, Tony Craig, to the international artists from Richard Prince, Palladino, to indeed Magdalena Jetelova. The exhibition had enormous response from the artists as well as from the critics. In 1986, she was invited to the 6th Biennale in Sydney. And it was in 1987 that Manfred Schnegeberger created or curated the next Documenta A. And Magdalena Jetelova was invited with her monumentals work. And it was also in 1987 that Linda Shearer, curator of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, selected Jetelova for a direction show there with 2 works by Magdalena Jetelova, Boban 1986 and Crossing from 1986. Both of these were sculptures. So this is the story of Magdalena Jetelova, who to me, together with Collage and Kupka, is a remarkable artist. I should say that her work is in the collection of the Hirshhorn Museum. It's also in the collection of Brooklyn Art Museum and at the Yale Art Gallery in the United States. She exhibited with John Weber, Jack Shaman, who were her key galleries promoting her work. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kalinovska. That was truly amazing. And I know I speak for myself, and I think I speak for everybody else in the audience, that this was just incredible to see the breadth of the work and the sort of thought and all the ideas presented here. Yeah, that was absolutely amazing. Going back to Kupka, we did have a question. If you could repeat who the early influencers were in Paris of his, and maybe speak a little bit about them as well.
Well, I think that in Paris, I don't think we would be necessarily talking about the influences, but what we would be talking about is the artists with whom he exchanged ideas. I mentioned Jacques Villon, Brother Duchamps, Fernand Léger, Delaunay, Duchamp. Later on, it was Giacometti, Hans Arp. He was interested also in the work, which he saw later on, of Kandinsky. But it was the many discussions which they had, indeed, in their studios. Some of them have shared their studios outside of Paris in Poutiers. Among them was also a very interesting, some very interesting poets. There were some interesting also theoretician, among them, for example, poet Apollinaire, who coined the term Orphism. And he saw Orphism moving from Cubism to works that were more abstract and that dedicated themselves particularly or stressed particularly or gave priority to light and color. And Kupka was indeed one of these artists. It's interesting that he was close to Marcel Duchamp because I don't see that they had so much in common, but maybe intellectually they did. And they stayed in touch for a very long period of time, exchanging letters and so on.
Wonderful, wow. Another question is going back to Magdalena Jetelova. We saw some of her very recent works as recent as 2017, and we are wondering if you know what she's working on now.
Oh, she has been invited to several exhibitions, particularly in Germany. So that's one thing that she's preparing. There is also an interview with her, which is going to be published. It's going to be in Czech, And because she couldn't meet with the person who was doing the interview had to be written, which for many of the visual artists is very difficult exercise because they are not writers. So this is what she has been concentrating on and doing.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm also wondering what the artworks are behind you on the wall. Yeah, can you
Thank you for asking. Well, these two are drawings by Magdalena Jetelova. I think they are from the 80s. I should say that I met Collage himself, so I was close to Collage to some extent, but I have been very close to Magdalena Jetelova because our age is very similar, and we traveled together in terms of exhibitions. It was me who invited her to be at the Riverside Studios. I met her for the first time at Tate. And since then, we have kept in touch. And so, you know, as a friend, she has kindly offered these works to me. Thank you for asking.
Wow, that's really amazing, and I can see the connection between the designs behind you and what we saw in her finished works. And
she's terrific in terms of drawing. Some of her drawings, particularly for bunkers, I have recently found out from Adela Procházková, are really remarkable because they are done on some kind of almost not a paper, but some kind of maybe paper, but it almost looks like a leather. So Magdalena Jetelova has an incredible sense of texture. And so her drawings have this remarkable presence. There still hasn't been a major exhibition of her drawings, which is something that should happen in the future.
I completely agree. And it's just so, it just adds another whole level of insight to see, you know, the drawings.
Indeed.
Yeah. I'm a big fan. Somebody in the chat was asking about where some of these works can be seen in New York, and somebody else already told us that Kupka is on view on floor 5 at the MoMA at the Orphic Cubists, and that's on view now. But if you know any others, I think I would.
I know that. Excuse me. I know that Kupka is always on view at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington, but unfortunately the floor in the East Wing is not open yet, but the work is there almost constantly. I don't think, Yeti Collage was twice exhibited recently, meaning during the few last years, at the Hirshhorn Museum as part of collection presentations, but it's not there any longer. And I don't think Jetelova work could be seen, but I'm sure that if one goes into different museums, whether Albright Knox, maybe Guggenheim, maybe Yale or Harvard, there is always a possibility that, you know, some of the works might be on view. Of course, if you are in Prague at the National Gallery, the work is definitely there. We had a major exhibition of his work done in cooperation with the Grand Palais at the National Gallery, and Anna Pravdová was a curator of that particular exhibition, which was indeed remarkable.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm wondering if you can, going back to Magdalena Jetelova, if you could talk a little bit about the significance of wood, since this is a medium she goes back to a lot.
Significance of?
Big pieces of wood?
Wood, yes. No, it's fascinating. She really started to work with wood right from the beginning. And there is a very interesting story which she has told to one critic when she was in London. Her entire family emigrated immediately after the invasion by the Soviet Union to Germany. Magdalena Jetelova decided not to. So she was living in this house which had empty cupboards, empty rooms, and she started to create for herself these objects, the table that somebody can sit down together with her. And so she started to use wood. It's interesting, you are right, because you can ask yourself a question, who in particular is working with wood? And we know that it was definitely Henry Moore. We also know that Konstantin Brancusi worked with wood. And I think for Magdalena to work with major pieces of wood was something that she was extremely excited about. By the way, I should mention that she never wanted to have a tree cut. She always used the wood that already existed. The tree was already dead. So it's very, very interesting. And she worked on these early pieces, indeed, without an assistant. So you can see that this beautiful woman was as strong as a very strong man.
That's quite remarkable. Wow. What a, yeah, that's amazing. Absolutely. I think that will do it for today. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing so much knowledge of this. Anybody who's watched this, who's watching right now, and if you're friends, if you think of a friend who couldn't join us today, we will be posting this through our channels at the Czech Center of New York. So please, you can definitely share this with your friends, and hopefully we'll see you soon at the next event. And once again, thank you so much, Milena. This was wonderful.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, the audience, for being part of this discussion. Thank you. Bye-bye.